Fear the Pale Blue What We Left Ourselves Episode 2. Tender the package had been sitting with Walt for 9 days. She'd walked past his desk 6 or 7 times during that stretch, and nodded when she had to and kept moving. Twice she'd gone down at 3 a.m. because sleep wasn't happening and standing inside the apartment felt like standing inside a held breath, and Walt had been at his desk both times. The radio turned low to a game that had already ended, working the crossword in the margin of the maintenance log. He hadn't mentioned the package. He just let it sit in the mail cage behind him, a padded envelope with her name on it in printed handwriting, and made nothing of it. That was Walt. The building was on 30th Street, between N and Dumbarton, a mid-rise from the 1950s with marble entry steps that had been repaired twice that she knew of, and a lobby that smelled of radiator dust in the cold months. The hallways were narrow. The elevator was original and slow. The fixtures in her unit were tired. The building management replaced them only when they failed, which she didn't mind. She had no investment in the apartment's appearance, only in its function, a place to sleep and store things and return to. She'd been there 8 years and had done nothing to it beyond replacing the cot when the spring gave and stocking the kitchen with what she needed. A spare bedroom she'd never furnished, a closet she'd turned into a workspace, a window over the kitchen sink that faced the building's rear courtyard, bare now, the dogwood that went yellow for about 6 days every October stripped clean by November. Georgetown had gone cold early this year. Bare trees on every block, brick row houses darkened by rain that came through every 2 or 3 days without any sense of arrival. The light lately was the kind you got when the clouds had been up for so long they started to feel permanent. Not dark, not dramatic. Just flat and closed, like a ceiling that had been lowered 6 inches and everyone had agreed to pretend it hadn't. She hadn't been outside much since the read-in. She'd been inside, mostly, working through what she knew, not the operational pieces. She'd had those already, or most of them. The structure of what the ICD was and did, and how long it had been doing it. What the read-in had given her was the frame those pieces fit into. The reason the program existed, and what it was protecting and from what, and the age of the thing, and the scale of it, and what her own function within it had served. She'd been told at the start of her career that she was closing loose ends for national security reasons, which was technically accurate in the way that a lock on a room can be accurate even when you don't know what's in the room. Now she knew what was in the room. It sat behind everything, not intrusively. She wasn't walking around in distress, wasn't losing her footing, wasn't experiencing anything she'd have recognized in a field report as compromised. But it was there. The way a fact was there once you knew it. The knowledge had weight, and the weight was evenly distributed, and that made it harder to locate, not easier. She tried in the days since to do what she usually did with things she couldn't examine directly. Put them in the drawer, file the weight there, let the function continue. It didn't hold. The drawer had always worked because she trusted the purpose it was serving, which meant she trusted that there was a purpose, which meant she didn't need to see past the immediate task to feel that the task was justified. That was the agreement she'd made with herself at 22 and kept for 15 years. The read-in had changed the agreement. It hadn't changed it by making the program illegitimate. She'd understood, standing in that facility, that what she'd been told was true and that the program was doing what it needed to do. She understood it intellectually, and she believed it, and it didn't help. What the drawer needed was not justification but distance. The read-in had closed the distance. She knew now, and knowing was not the same as not knowing. She woke at 5:47 a.m., without an alarm, put her feet on the floor, sat. The floor was cold through her socks. She went to the hook by the door and checked the inside left pocket of her jacket. Her fingers touched the edge of the photograph and she pulled her hand back and went to start the coffee. The assignment came through her channel at 7:14. She was still at the kitchen table, second cup. The rear courtyard was gray outside the window, the dogwood bare and still, a plastic bag caught in one of the lower branches that hadn't been there yesterday. The message was formatted the way all of them were formatted, spare, minimal, the situation rendered in the fewest words that could carry it. A name, Lewis Carr. A location, Zanesville, Ohio. Task category, protection and relocation. Not an assessment, not a close. She read it twice. Then she read the destination reference, a number string. She tried it against the index she carried in her head, which was not small, nothing. She pulled her secondary channel and queried 2 of the index systems she had access to through it. Nothing. She went to the third, nothing registered, no designation she could trace. She set the cup down on the table and sat with that for a moment. Not long. A moment was what it required. Then she got up and went to the bedroom closet and took out the bag she kept staged there. Packing it took 4 minutes. She'd had it organized the same way for 11 years, the same categories in the same positions, because the time you spent looking for something during the pack was time you didn't have. With the bag closed, she went back to the hook by the door and put on her jacket and didn't check the pocket again. She went downstairs. Walt was in the back hall. The morning shift super started at 8:00 and it was 7:40, so he had 20 minutes left at his desk. He had the thermos, the reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. The radio on the desk was on something quiet. She couldn't identify the program, just the register of voices. He looked up when she came down the back stairs. "You going somewhere?" "Ohio, huh?" He didn't ask anything else. He turned in his chair, slow because of the knee, and reached into the mail cage behind him and retrieved the padded envelope and held it out. "This came while you were gone, the last time." She took it, her name in printed handwriting, no return address, the postmark smudged to illegibility. "What day?" 11 days ago. I was going to say something." "You did, tonight." He leaned back in his chair. "Ohio in November, that's commitment." "They said snow." "Yeah, they say that." He picked up his thermos, unscrewed the cap. The steam came up briefly. "Early start for you. I like the highway clear." He nodded like that was a reasonable position on Ohio, which it was. She tucked the envelope under her arm. He was watching her the way he always watched her when she came through, not invasively, not the way someone watched you when they wanted something from you. More like how a person watched a thing they were keeping an eye on as a matter of routine and without urgency. Walt kept an eye on a lot of things. He never did anything with what he saw except hold it. "Safe to have you back," he said, which meant safe drive and have a good trip and come back all at once, the way Walt compressed things. She left through the service door. His radio came up slightly behind her, audible for about 3 seconds before the door sealed it off. Interstate 270 out of D.C. was quiet at that hour, just trucks and early commuters who'd given up fighting the traffic and moved their day forward by an hour and a half. She got through the Beltway by 8 and picked up 70 west of Columbus in her head, the route already set. The padded envelope was on the passenger seat. She didn't touch it. She thought about the assignment: protection and relocation. The previous one had been a young analyst named Tessa Vaughn, an analyst who'd had no idea she was in danger, who'd been frightened when Renn arrived and grateful when it was over. She'd thanked Renn, actually thanked her, and Renn had filed that in a place she didn't have a category for because it was the first time in 15 years anyone on the other side of an assignment had done anything of the kind. That one had been routed to her channel, a closer's channel. Protection and extraction work had its own people, its own routing paths, not the same as Renn's path. The routing on that assignment had been wrong. She'd noted it. The destination, too, had carried no designation she could match to anything in the system she had access to. She'd filed both, and she hadn't reported them. Now this. Protection and relocation again to her channel again, and again a destination she couldn't trace. She turned it over methodically, the way she turned things over. 2 was a number. Coincidence existed. She'd seen it in the field, the way 2 things that looked related turned out to be adjacent without connection. She weighed that against what she knew about the program's routing protocols, which were not casual, which were not given to coincidence, which were engineered to put the right work in front of the right person. A closer was not the right person for protection work. The program knew that. The program's routing system was built on that knowledge, which meant the routing was deliberate, which meant someone had made a choice twice about where to send this work. The shape of a hand. That was what it felt like. Not a name, not a face, not a motive she could articulate, just the felt form of a selection being made, assignments moving toward her through a channel that should have directed them somewhere else and not doing so. She turned it over once more and came up against the same absence. No identity, no evident logic, nothing she could put in a report because a report required facts and the only fact she had was the pattern itself. 2 wasn't enough for certainty. 2 was enough to watch. She filed it in a place that wasn't the drawer because the drawer was for things she was setting aside, and this she wasn't setting aside. She kept it on the surface where she could look at it, the way you kept a developing contact in view while you waited for them to show themselves. Ohio opened up around her. Flat land, brown at the edges, an exit for wheeling she didn't take. The sky out here was the same sealed gray as DC but with more room in it, the horizon visible, the weather system showing itself as an object rather than just a ceiling. They'd said snow. The clouds looked like they could deliver. The address was on Maple Avenue in Zanesville, which was a city of about 25,000 people in east-central Ohio, a city that had been larger during a period when the thing it made was needed, and had contracted since then without ever fully reconciling to the contraction. The streets near the river had a few things in them: a diner, a bar, a pharmacy with holiday decorations already up on the 1st of November, and the residential blocks fanned out from there in the orderly, undramatic way of Midwestern cities where the grid held and the planning had been done by people who expected life to be livable rather than notable. She drove Maple Avenue twice before she parked. The second pass was slower. The trees along the block had been planted at the same time, she thought, and were all the same age and bare now, creating the visual of a street that had been designed rather than grown. The sidewalks were clean. 3 houses had American flags on the porch posts, 2 of them faded to near pink. At the south end of the block, a small dog sat behind a storm door and tracked her car as she passed. Maple Avenue was quiet, mostly single-family houses, a few converted doubles. She parked a block and a half north on a section of street where parking was loose and her sight lines were good. Turned the engine off. Left the heat running on battery. The house was a single story with aluminum siding that had been white and was now the color of old paper, a covered porch with 2 chairs that she didn't think anyone sat in much, and a hydrangea on the left side of the front walk that had been cut back for winter and looked like a collection of sticks in dry soil. The curtains in the front window were cream-colored. She watched them. Nothing for 12 minutes. She ate a granola bar she'd had in the jacket pocket and drank the last of the coffee from the thermos she'd brought. The coffee was cold. She drank it anyway. Then the curtain moved slightly once. The particular shift of fabric that meant someone had stepped near the window and away from it quickly. He'd been at the window. She stayed in the car. A mail carrier came through at 10:22 a.m. and moved down the block house by house. Carr's address got a single envelope. She watched the delivery without moving. At 10:31, a woman walked a retriever mix on the far side of the street. The dog wanted to stop at every third house and the woman was patient about it. They went south and didn't come back. At 10:44, a dark green Silverado, 2020, Ohio plates with a partial read of EKR, blocked by a truck in the lot behind her, came down Maple at under the speed limit and stopped 2 houses south of Carr's address. It sat there. The engine stayed on, which she could tell from the exhaust vapor. The driver was a shape through the fogged side glass, seated, not moving, not on a phone she could see, not eating. 6 minutes. She counted. At 10:50, she did a second look at the driver, not trying to be subtle about it, and the truck pulled away. Made a left at the end of the block and she lost it. She stayed another 4 minutes. Then she put on her jacket, picked up the padded envelope from the passenger seat out of reflex and got out of the car. The porch steps were solid, recently painted. She knocked at 10:55. The quiet on the other side of the door lasted 12 seconds. She counted those too. He'd been close already. 12 seconds was not 12 seconds of crossing a house. 12 seconds was 12 seconds of standing near the door before opening it, or opened. Louis Carr was in his mid-60s with a face that had settled into its final arrangement, long jaw, gray through the beard and at his temples, a nose that had been broken some time ago and had healed at a slight angle. He wore a flannel shirt and corduroys and house slippers that were not new, and he held a mug in his left hand, and he looked at her. The look lasted a beat longer than a greeting look lasted. Not rude, deliberate. He was reading something. MS. Renn, he said. She hadn't sent ahead. Her name wasn't in anything he'd have received. Mr. Carr, come in out of the cold. He stepped back. He moved the way some older men moved, without hurry and not performing the absence of hurry. actually at the pace of a man who had learned over a very long time that the next thing would arrive in its own interval and that moving faster toward it generally didn't alter when it arrived. She went inside. The house was warm. He kept it warmer than she kept her own place, or than most people did in her experience. The wall thermostat in the front hallway read 72 degrees, and the way the warmth felt, settled and even, a temperature that had been held consistently, suggested it had read something close to 72 for a long time. The front room was the room of a person who lived in it. A couch and 2 chairs around a low table. A bookcase that took up the full south wall, real books, not display books, spines cracked, read, some flagged with torn paper strips or pen caps wedged in at page breaks. A small television she doubted he used for much. A window facing the street, the cream curtain, a chair positioned near it. The chess table was against the far wall, a proper board, mid-game on the white side with the black pieces removed entirely. He was playing against himself. White only. He took his mug back toward the kitchen without asking if she wanted anything and returned a moment later with a second mug, and set it on the low table in front of one of the chairs and sat down in the other one and picked up his mug. She hadn't sat. She was still standing near the door, which was her practice in any new space. She didn't sit until she'd assessed it, and he'd set the second mug in a position that made the nearest chair comfortable to sit in, and he didn't say anything about either fact. The mug, when she picked it up, held tea, plain black, not sweet, not dressed up. "You've been watching from the street," he said. "For a while, since before 10. I noticed the car at 10 past." She looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the chess problem, or at the vicinity of it, the easy, unfocused look of a man thinking about something else. "You know what kind of car? The one that's been there the last several days isn't yours." He finally looked at her. "Different model, darker. Tell me about the one that's been there the last several days." He did. She listened. Not the Silverado, a gray sedan he'd noted 3 times in the past week in varying positions, once across the street, twice at the north end of the block where parking was loose. He hadn't noted plates. He was consistent about the color and the type and the fact that he'd never seen the driver. The Silverado plus a gray sedan. "How long has this been going on?" she said. "The sedan, about 8 days. He shifted in his chair. "Before you ask, no, I didn't report it. I've been through enough of these to know when the reporting is going to help and when it's going to arrive after the fact. You should have reported it." "Probably." He picked up the white king from the chessboard and set it down a square over, which wasn't a legal move. He was resetting something. "That's why you're here instead of a letter saying your location has changed." She moved through the house then. Living room, the narrow hall, 2 bedrooms, one clearly used, one clearly not, with a card table and a box of files she'd look at later. A bathroom with a single shelf of basics. The kitchen. The kitchen was in the back. A window that looked out on the yard. The yard was small, dead grass, a propane grill sheeted in a tarp, a wooden fence at 6 feet that showed some weathering but was structurally solid. An alley gate that latched from inside. She tested it. The latch needed a little pressure but held. She came back to the front room. He was still in his chair, still with the chess pieces. "What are you leaving behind?" He looked around the room the way a person looked at something they'd been inside so long they'd stopped perceiving it as separate from themselves. "The furniture, most of the books, I've been through them, the television, the board." He stood then and went to the bookcase and pulled a composition notebook from the second shelf, narrow and dense, and held it up. "And this is coming." "What is it?" "A record of what I've been working through." He tucked it under his arm. "Not operational, just thinking. I've had time for it." She was looking at the chessboard. "You play alone. I work problems." He set the notebook down in the chair behind him. "I found when I had the opponent I was competing. When I took the opponent away I started to see the board differently. It took about 2 years." He said this as a person stated a fact, not as someone seeking a response. "Is there anything you need to look at before we go?" "I need the alley and then we can talk." She went out the back. The alley ran between maple and pine and smelled of cold concrete and something organic and wet, a compost pile somewhere, leaves that had gone down and hadn't been cleared. A cat sat on a fence post midway down the alley and tracked her with its eyes and didn't move. She went the full length, checking what was visible over fences and gates, noting the 2 cameras on the house at the south end and the one at a garage 2/3 of the way down that faced the alley entrance. The house with the dog she'd heard on her way in. She couldn't see the dog from here. She came back to the north end and stood at the alley entrance for 40 seconds. No gray sedan. No Silverado. A vehicle that had been watching a house didn't need to park on the same street. It needed line of sight or a point of contact, and if it was good it wouldn't give her either while she was out in the open looking. She'd seen the Silverado leave when she'd made her second look at the driver. That meant they'd noticed her noticing, which meant they knew she was there, which meant they had 40 minutes to change their configuration. She went back in through the kitchen door. "We're leaving at 1, she said. "Pack what you need." "The bag's already packed." He was at the stove doing something with a pot on the back burner, not hurried about it. The kitchen smelled of something that had been cooking for a while before she arrived. "Sit down. I'll put lunch together. Mr. Carr, it's soup." He said it the way someone stated a simple fact to a person who was about to complicate it unnecessarily. "You drove from D.C. this morning. You had coffee and whatever the service station off of Route 40 considers food. It takes 15 minutes to eat, and 15 minutes to eat is not going to change the departure window." He turned and looked at her. "Sit." She looked at him. He was already facing the stove again. She pulled out one of the 2 chairs at the kitchen table. The table was small under the window that faced the yard. From the chair on the left side she had the yard, the fence, and a clear view of the alley gate. She sat in the chair on the left. The soup was lentil, with cumin and something else she couldn't name, not intrusive. He set it in front of her with a spoon and a piece of bread on a folded paper towel, and then sat across from her with his own bowl and didn't say anything for a while. She ate. Good. She didn't comment on it. The yard outside the window was brown and still. A crow came down on the fence, looked at the yard for a moment with the focused inattention of a bird assessing cover, and left. A second crow followed it about 30 seconds later, then left too. He ate without looking at her. He ate with the economy of someone who treated eating as a thing to do properly and without ceremony. "The ones they usually send," he said. He wasn't finishing the sentence yet. She waited. He broke a piece of bread and ate it before continuing. "Efficient, polite, follow the protocol, know the signs. You read the way they do mostly." He looked at the soup. "You're looking at this differently." "How do I look?" "Like someone who's had a change in what they know." He picked up his mug and drank from it before the soup was gone, which she noted because it meant tea was already on, which meant he'd anticipated lunch being a sitting thing rather than a standing thing. "The ones before you, they moved me and they went. Efficient. They were doing a function. I was a function." He set the mug down. "You came in and you looked at the chessboard." "I look at everything." "Yes, but you looked at it specifically. You paused at it." He turned the spoon in his soup once. The last 4 didn't pause anywhere. She ate. Outside, the crow came back to the fence, looked, went away again. "What did you see?" she said. "Originally, the thing that brought you into this." He looked up at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not defensive, not closed, but deliberate in the way a pause in a conversation was deliberate when the person was deciding how much of a door to open. "Does that affect what you're doing today?" "Might. How?" "If what you know is still relevant to an active program component, the threat profile is different than if it's historical." He considered this seriously, which she appreciated. He wasn't playing for time or deflecting. He was actually thinking it through. "No," he said finally. "What I know, what I knew originally, is historical. The thing I saw doesn't have operational implications that I'm aware of. They told me that much many years ago. I'm not current." "Then why move you now?" "Because I'm still inconvenient to have loose." He said it without bitterness, a straightforward assessment. Information ages, but the existence of the person doesn't. I'm still a person who knows things exist. That's apparently worth managing. He ate. "Is there anything else you needed to know to do your job?" "No." "Then let me tell you something that isn't about the job." He leaned back a little. "You're newly read-in." She kept her expression where it was. "Not guessing," he said. "The ones they sent before the read-in, they were doing their jobs. I was a thing to do. You walked in and looked at the chessboard and you had soup, and that's not in the protocol. That's someone who is still working out what the protocol is for." "Broke more bread." "I've seen that look twice. Once on a woman who came through here 6 years ago and wouldn't sit down and wouldn't eat anything and left within 4 minutes of arriving, and she'd been red in that week." I didn't know that at the time. I worked it out later. The second was on a man I knew before all of this who found out something he hadn't known and walked around for 3 months looking like the floor was slightly lower than expected. He met her eyes. It gets less acute. She watched him. That's not a reassurance, he said. I'm not offering reassurance, it's just what happens. The adjustment completes. You start occupying the new configuration. He picked up his mug for what that's worth. She finished the soup, she picked up the bread and ate it. Outside, nothing moved in the yard. How do you do it, she said. This. He looked at her. This specifically. 22 years in one place, one arrangement. She wasn't sure why she was asking. She'd asked it before she decided to ask it. How do you build a life inside something that size? He was quiet for a moment, not avoiding the question, processing it the way he processed everything, with the patience of someone who had learned that the first version of an answer was rarely the most accurate one. You don't build a life, he said. You don't decide one day that this is a life you're building. You wake up one day and it's what you have and you decide whether that's workable. He set the mug down carefully, both hands, the way he handled things. I made a choice at the beginning to stay inside the transaction rather than fight it, not because I was beaten, because I looked at the transaction clearly and I decided it was the better option. He looked at the table between them. The people who don't do that, the ones who fight it, I've heard about 2 of them over the years. Obliquely, the way you hear about things in here. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. She knew what happened to the ones who fought it. That was part of what she'd been doing for 15 years. The chess problems, she said. He looked up. That's how you stay inside it. That's one way. He stood and took both bowls to the sink and rinsed them, which wasn't necessary. They were leaving. The dishes didn't matter, but he rinsed them anyway. The reflex of a man who kept his own house. I write. In the notebook, I garden in the spring and fall, though I never got serious about it. I follow 3 or 4 subjects I've always found interesting and I read about them. He turned the water off. I made a peace with a small life. The smallness doesn't bother me the way people assume it should. He dried his hands on a towel on the oven handle. The thing that bothers me is different. She waited. He didn't say what the thing was. He folded the towel and set it back and looked out the back window at the yard. Ready, he said. When you are. She did one more walk of the house at 12:40, checking windows, checking the front street through a narrow angle of the curtain. Nothing had changed outside. The Silverado wasn't visible from any angle she could access from inside. The gray sedan he described wasn't visible either, which meant both of them were somewhere she couldn't see. Or one or both were gone and she wouldn't know until she was on the street. At 12:55 she came back to the front room. Coat. He had it in his hand already. Wool, good quality, worn at the elbows, a coat you kept because it still worked. He put it on. He picked up the duffel from beside the bedroom door and the composition notebook from the chair where he'd set it and tucked the notebook into the duffel. The bookcase got one last look. He stood in front of it for a moment and then took one book. She couldn't read the title from here and put it in 2. He looked at the chessboard. Leave it, she said. He looked at it a moment longer and then looked at her and didn't say anything and went toward the front door. She went out first. Walked to the end of the block, casual, checking the parked cars, checking the angles, came back. A woman across the street she hadn't seen that morning was placing a holiday wreath on the door of the Colonial Revival 2 houses down. A bicycle, navy blue, road frame, a cable lock through the front wheel, was locked to a signpost at the edge of Carr's property. She hadn't seen it when she'd arrived. She noted it twice. The bicycle went in the filing position. She didn't know whose it was, and she couldn't determine in the time she had whether it was a point of contact marker or an ordinary bicycle parked by an ordinary neighbor who rode. She'd report it later. The car came around so the passenger door was 6 feet from his front steps. He came out, locked the door, and got in. Not slow, not fast. The pace of someone who knew how to move without looking like he was trying. She pulled away before he'd finished closing the door. You've done this before, she said. I told you, finally. She made 2 turns in the first 3 minutes. The rear view showed her an ordinary Zanesville afternoon behind them, nothing she recognized. She cut through a stretch of residential blocks she'd mapped that morning and came out on Elm Street heading west, staying off the main roads for the first 10 miles. The bicycle, she said. He turned and looked at her. What bicycle? Locked to the signpost in front of your house. When did that appear? He thought about it. I didn't notice it this morning. When you were at the window. I was at the window at 10. I saw your car. I didn't see a bicycle. He faced forward. Is that? He stopped. I don't know yet. She picked up Route 40 and headed west. Tell me about the gray sedan again, specifically the last time you saw it. He told her. The last sighting had been 2 days ago, late afternoon, the north end of the block. He'd seen it from the front window after dark, which meant the driver had still been there after the street lights came on, which was a choice a person made when they were willing to accept the visibility, or when they'd stopped worrying about it. Did they ever do anything, she said. In any of the 3 times? No, they just sat. And you never saw the driver. I don't have good angles from inside. He paused. Should I have reported it? Yes. All right. I know you said probably. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. I've been sitting in that house for 22 years and nothing has happened. You start to believe nothing will happen. The monitoring is there and then the monitoring is there and you stop seeing it as meaningful. And then he gestured slightly, a contained gesture, a hand turned out and back. And then she drove. The road out of Zanesville was a road that had been improved once and then frozen in that improvement. 4 lanes that narrowed to 2 without warning, a median that appeared and disappeared, signage that gave you less information than you wanted. The sky ahead was slightly different from the sky behind, which meant the weather system to the west was moving. At a BP station outside Reynoldsburg, she pulled off. Stay in the car. She went in, bought 2 bottles of water, walked the perimeter of the lot, checked the exit angles, checked what was parked on the far side of the pumps. Nothing she recognized. No gray sedan, no Silverado, nothing with Ohio plates beginning with EKR. She came back. He took the bottle without comment. They got back on the highway. The ones they usually send, she said, returning to the thing he hadn't finished. He opened the water bottle, drank, capped it. I was going to say, they're efficient. They move me and they leave. None of them ate soup. I was hungry, yes. He set the bottle on the seat beside him. That's the point. He looked out the window at the flat Ohio landscape going past, brown and bare. The ones before, it was a transaction. I was something to move. They weren't unkind. I don't mean that. He turned the cap of the water bottle over in his hand. You came in and you looked at the chessboard. And you asked about the sedan, the history of it, not just the operational now of it, and you ate the soup. He put the cap back on the bottle. The transaction looked different from the inside. She drove. She didn't answer him. Is that new for you, he said, or has it always been this way? What? Noticing the transaction from the inside. He said it without pressure, just asking. She thought about how to answer. She wasn't sure she had an answer. No, she said finally. He nodded like he understood what that meant, which she supposed he did. She stayed at 80 where she could. Columbus approached, sprawled its way across the landscape, a smear of light and signs and off-ramps that went on longer than you expected and then ended. She navigated through the eastern edge of it, picking up 670 briefly, and then down to surface roads for the last stretch into Gahanna. Carr was quiet for most of it, looking out the window, his hand on the duffel in his lap. He fell into the quiet the way she fell into hers, not restlessly, not because there was nothing to say, but because the silence was the right texture for the drive. The neighborhood in Gahanna was east of the city center, a subdivision called Briar Glen. Houses all built within a couple years of each other. She'd guessed 1984 or 1985, in the alternating split-level and colonial revival pattern that developers used in that decade to give the appearance of variety. The street was quiet and maintained. Cars in driveways, an occasional basketball hoop, a pair of houses with decorative corn stalks still up on the front steps. The house they were going to was a colonial in taupe with black shutters and a 2-car garage. Blinds in every window set at the same angle. A flower bed to the left of the front door. Winter prep, the soil turned. No neighbors visible, no traffic on the street. The houses on either side were quiet and dark, which was not how occupied houses in a working neighborhood looked at 4 in the afternoon. She clocked it. The ICD had bought distance around this address or arranged for it. They were good at that. She pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment with the engine on. This is it, she said. He looked at the house for a moment. His expression didn't shift into anything she could identify, but he was assessing it. She could see that, the attention behind the stillness. How long this time? That's not information I have. He nodded. Fair. They went up the front walk. She had the access code from her channel. The keypad locks were new, a brand she recognized, and the code took on the first try, and the door opened into a front hall with a coat rack and a console table and a lamp with a narrow shade. Everything neutral, coordinated in the way of a space that had been staged rather than lived in. She walked the house. Clean carpets, a smell of new and empty. The thermostat read 68. Kitchen stocked to basic but real provisions. A working refrigerator with food in it. Cabinets with rice and pasta and canned things. A coffee maker with a timer that had already done its job, the pot still warm. Bedroom with a made bed and a dresser with empty drawers and a window that faced the quiet backyard. A second bedroom done as a study. Desk, lamp, 2 chairs, a window. No books. She made a note of the absence of books. The backyard had a 6-foot wooden privacy fence and a gate that latched from inside and was new and solid. The garage was empty, and its interior door connected to the kitchen through a utility room. She stood in the utility room for a moment. The washer and dryer were new. The shelving was clean and empty, a single fluorescent light above her. She thought about his house on Maple Avenue, the books with the flagged pages, the cracked spines, the chess problems he worked alone. 22 years of a life accumulated there. She thought about how many times he'd been through this. Findlay, Kentucky, Zanesville, now this. How many times he'd walked through a new house that smelled like no one had lived in it and been told the check-in schedule and been handed a folder with a contact protocol and a page of emergency numbers he'd probably never be in a position to use. She went back to the kitchen. The perimeter's clean, she said. There's a contact protocol in the folder on the counter. Check-in schedule, signaling protocol if something's wrong, emergency line. Don't let the check-in schedule slip. I know how this works. Knowing and doing. Yes. He set his duffel on the table. He was looking out the window above the sink at the backyard, the wooden fence. The light was going fast now. Barely 4:30 and the sky already purple at the edges. 22 years, he said. He wasn't saying it to her, not directly, more like saying it into the room. You pack everything into 2 bags, you learn what you actually need. Most of what I've accumulated I've left behind 4 times. You get more precise each time. She checked the folder. The protocol was complete. He pulled the composition notebook out of the duffel and set it on the kitchen table and then set the book on top of it. She could see the title now. A History of Early Arctic Exploration, the orange spine battered. He stood there with a cup of the leftover coffee he'd poured himself and looked at the yard. No books, he said. I'll put it in. There's a used bookstore on Morrison Road, about 2 miles. He turned from the window. It's been there a while, good one. She wrote it down on the edge of the contact protocol sheet. She'd added to the handoff notes. He watched her write it down, and something in his face shifted slightly. Not moved, not surprised, something quieter than that. They stood in the kitchen for a moment with nothing that needed doing. The coffee maker ticked as it cooled. You're going, he said. Soon? Do you want any of the coffee? No. He nodded. He looked at the yard again. She finished the check of the folder and confirmed the first check-in date and set it back on the counter. He was still at the window. What you asked at the table, he said, about how to build a life inside something that size. He turned the cup in his hands. The thing I didn't say. She looked at him. The thing that bothers me, not the smallness. He was looking at the cup. The thing that bothers me is that I can't tell if I made a peace with it or if I was made into someone who could make a peace with it. He turned the cup slowly, both hands. There's a difference. I've had 22 years and I still don't know which one it is. She stood in the kitchen doorway. She didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say. He wasn't asking for her to say something. I think, he said, that eventually it stops mattering, which it was, because you're the thing that emerged regardless, and the thing that emerged is what does the next 20 years. He set the cup down. That might be peace and it might be something else, depends on the day. She had her coat on. She'd buttoned it while he was talking and hadn't noticed doing it. Is there anything you need before I go, she said. He looked at her then. Full look, the reading look he'd had at the front door that morning. He held it for a moment. Someone asked me that the first time, a long time ago. I told them yes. He looked at the notebook on the table. It didn't change much what I asked for. She had the front door open when he said it. MS, Renn. He hadn't moved from the kitchen. His voice was the same, measured, dry, the same register he'd held all day. You're good at what you do, thank you. I meant that as something to sit with. He paused, not for effect, just because that was where the sentence stopped. What we're good at and what we become are not always the same thing, but sometimes they are. She stood in the doorway. Have a safe drive back, he said. She left. The drive back was mostly dark. She picked up 670 to 70 east and held 80 miles an hour where the road allowed it. The weather system that had been building all afternoon arrived somewhere in the eastern Ohio stretch. Not snow, just rain, the highway going reflective and dark. She drove through it. Her wipers needed replacement and she noted it. She stopped once outside of Cambridge at a rest area. Used the facilities, bought a bad sandwich from a vending machine and ate half of it standing by the car. The rain had paused. She could see stars briefly through a gap in the clouds, the first stars she'd seen in a while. A trucker idled in the far end of the lot, the cab lit orange from inside. She watched it for a moment. Then the clouds closed back and she got in the car. She thought about the bicycle. It had been in position the whole time she was there. From inside the car, she hadn't been able to determine whether the lock was engaged. She'd seen the cable through the front wheel but couldn't see if it went around the post. A bicycle left overnight in November wasn't unusual in a neighborhood. People left bicycles locked for days. It might have been there when she drove in and she'd missed it in the initial sweep. Possible, not likely. She'd report it along with the Silverado and the gray sedan and let someone else determine whether those three things connected. She thought about Carr, not the assignment. The assignment was done and filed and complete. She thought about the chessboard with only white pieces. 4 relocations across 40 years, a wool coat worn at the elbows, a notebook of things he'd worked through with no one to work them through at. She thought about a man who could tell whether a person had eaten that morning by how they moved through a room, and who had read her inside of 12 seconds at the door, and who still didn't know, after 2 decades, whether the piece he'd made was something he'd chosen or something that had been made in him by the arrangement. The question he'd left in the air, the one she kept circling back to, whether there was a difference, whether, after long enough, it mattered. She came around the western edge of Pennsylvania, and the highway started to feel like the highway she'd been on at 8 a.m. The same road moving east now, the beltway coming up, the clustered light of the metropolitan area spreading on the horizon. She picked up the Cabin John Bridge and the long familiar slide into D.C. from the northwest, the Georgetown Pike, Canal Road, M Street. By 11:40 she was nearly home. The streets were quiet, slicked from the rain that had preceded her. She parked in the structure on Water Street and walked back to 30th. Walt was at his desk in the back hall. The radio was barely audible, something he'd found at this hour, the mix of voices she couldn't identify. He looked up when she came in through the service entrance. "Ohio," he said. "Back. How was it?" "Quiet, mostly." He considered this. That a good thing or a bad one? Good. Okay. He reached into the mail cage, put his hand on something, stopped. "Right, that was it, the envelope. I took it this morning." "Right." He took his hand back, picked up his thermos instead. He offered it in her direction in the general way he offered things, not extending it, not making it a thing, just acknowledging it existed and she was present. She shook her head. He put it back. "You should sleep." "I'm going to. Cold front coming tomorrow." He turned back to the log, the crossword in the margin. She could see he was nearly finished with it. "Package in the mail cage for the woman in 4B if she comes down. I wrote it in. I'll let her know if I see her. Already left her a note." He looked up at her once, briefly. "Safe to have you back." She went upstairs. The apartment was the same. She'd left it this morning and it was the same tonight, which was how she needed it. Jacket on the hook by the door, bag at the foot of the bed. She'd unpack it tomorrow. She turned on the kitchen light and not the front room light and poured 2 fingers of bourbon she didn't drink and stood at the window over the sink and looked at the rear courtyard. The dogwood was bare. A light on in a window across the way that hadn't been lit in weeks. Someone coming back from somewhere. A trip or a house somewhere else where they'd spent November. The courtyard was quiet. The rain had stopped while she was driving and the paving stones were dark and still. She looked at the courtyard for a while. She hadn't stood at this window much in the days since the read-in, the table mostly, or the spare room, moving through things. The courtyard had dropped out of her attention entirely. Now it was just the courtyard, just the bare tree and the wet stone and the light from across the way, Familiar the way things were familiar when you'd been somewhere long enough for familiarity to become weight. She did not take the photograph out. The weight of the jacket on the hook, the familiar hang of it, the slight forward pull on the left side. She was aware of it. Her hand didn't go to it. She stood at the window and drank half the bourbon and looked at the courtyard and didn't think about the photograph and didn't think about the 46, which hadn't changed for 2 assignments now, which wasn't a number she'd spent much time thinking about before the read-in and had spent too much time thinking about since. What she was thinking about was his voice. Not the whole conversation, not even most of it. The last part, from the doorway of the top Colonial on Briar Glen Drive, his voice coming from the kitchen without strain, without performance, the same dry measured register he'd held all day. She heard it again now in the kitchen of her Georgetown apartment, and it sat in the room with her more clearly than anything else that was in the room. What we're good at and what we become are not always the same thing, but sometimes they are. She'd understood it when he said it, not a second later, not on the drive back, right then standing in the doorway with her coat buttoned. She'd understood it, and she'd stood there a beat longer than she should have and then walked to the car. 15 years. She was good at what she did. That was not in question. She'd been good at it from the second year and had improved steadily, and the work showed it. Nobody was better at what she did than she was. She'd closed 46 people. She'd done it cleanly, competently, professionally, and she'd never lost a target, never left a scene wrong, never drawn attention that stayed on her. Nobody performed the function better. And Louis Carr had spent 22 years in a small house in Zanesville working chess problems by himself, and he'd looked at her over a soup bowl and read her accurately and known things about her that she hadn't told him. And he'd said what he'd said the way a person said a thing they'd thought through for a very long time to a person who was just now beginning to think it. He was 60-something, and he'd been in the machine 40-something years longer than she had, and he'd made a peace with something or been made into something that could make a peace with it, and he still didn't know which one it was after 2 decades. She wasn't sure if that was a warning. She wasn't sure it wasn't. The kitchen light went off. She crossed to the front room and sat in the chair by the dark window. The courtyard was out the other way, but the front window faced 30th Street. Bare trees on the block, a car parked across the way, a light on in the row house at the end. She sat with the bourbon and didn't drink it and didn't sleep. She heard him say it again.